Daniel had always imagined that buying his own home would feel like the beginning of a calm, stable chapter in his life. For years he had rented small apartments, moving every few years because the rent went up, or the building was too noisy, or the neighbors were always changing. He wanted something different now, something steady, something that felt like it belonged to him. When he found the small single-story house at the end of a quiet street, it felt like the perfect place. The street was lined with trees that gave soft shade in the afternoon. The lawns looked neatly trimmed. The whole neighborhood carried a peaceful kind of silence that made him feel he had finally found the right place. The house itself wasn't huge. It had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room that felt cozy rather than spacious. But Daniel didn't need more. He liked the feeling of everything being within easy reach. When he walked through the house during the first viewing, he felt something settle in him, like he could finally breathe fully. He imagined summer evenings sitting on the small porch, watering the potted plants he planned to bring, maybe having a quiet dinner outside when the weather was good. That image stayed in his mind long after he left, and by the end of the week he decided to buy the place. He knew the neighborhood had an HOA, but he didn't think much of it. He'd heard mixed things about HOAs. In general, some kept places clean and organized. Others could be a bit controlling. But during the buying process, the real estate agent assured him the HOA mostly handled landscaping and community maintenance. She told him it was simple, nothing to worry about. So Daniel signed everything, picked up the keys, and moved in with a feeling of hope and a little bit of excitement. The first few days were peaceful. Daniel unpacked slowly, taking his time. He arranged his kitchen the way he wanted, set up a small reading corner in the living room, and placed a few potted plants along the edge of the porch. He had always liked plants. They made any space feel alive. In the evenings, he walked around the neighborhood to get familiar with it. He noticed families taking walks with their kids, people sitting in their yards chatting, and older couples watering their flowers or trimming hedges. Everyone seemed friendly at first glance. He waved to a few neighbors and some waved back politely. Nothing felt unusual. On the 4th morning after moving in, Daniel stepped outside to take out the trash and noticed a small envelope tucked into the crack of his front door. At first he thought it might be a welcome note or something simple, maybe from a neighbor. But when he opened it, he saw the HOA logo printed on the top, followed by a short message about his trash bin being visible from the street. It said he should store it out of sight when not in use. Daniel blinked at the paper, feeling a little confused. The trash bin had been pulled back to the side of his house, exactly where the previous owner kept it. It wasn't blocking anything. It wasn't sitting out by the road. It was just sitting there, the way he assumed everyone kept theirs. He walked around and looked at the bin from different angles. If someone stood at a certain spot on the sidewalk, maybe they could see a part of it. But barely. Still, he didn't want any problems, so he moved it behind a short wooden screen the previous owner had installed. He shrugged it off as a small thing. He didn't like how formal the note felt, especially since he had only been there a few days, but he told himself not to overthink it. A week passed. Daniel settled deeper into the routine of the new house. He woke up early, made coffee, sat on the porch, and enjoyed the mild breeze. He started making plans for the backyard. Maybe a small garden bed, maybe a few solar lights. He liked imagining how he could make the place feel more like home. But then another envelope appeared. This one mentioned a porch decoration concern. Daniel frowned as he read it. The letter claimed that one of his potted plants was too close to the porch railing and might affect the uniform appearance of the homes. He reread the line twice, even 3 times. It made no sense. Plant was just a simple green pot with a small flowering plant inside. Nothing loud, nothing unusual, nothing messy. He walked outside and looked around the neighborhood. A few houses had wind chimes, some had garden statues, and one even had a large birdhouse hanging near the front window. His plant looked far more ordinary compared to all that. It didn't stand out in any way. He moved the pot a little farther back just to avoid trouble, though he felt a small sting of irritation this time. It felt like he was being singled out for things that didn't matter. 2 days later, another notice appeared. This time it said the paint on his fence had a chipped spot near the bottom and recommended he repaint it within a week. That one made Daniel laugh out loud because the chip was no bigger than a fingernail. The fence had looked exactly like that when he bought the house. He crouched down to look at it more closely. Yes, there was a tiny mark. But repainting the whole fence for that felt extreme. He started feeling uneasy. This wasn't normal. He wondered if other people got notices like this too, or if he was the only one receiving them. So that evening, during his walk around the neighborhood, he approached a neighbor, a quiet man who often watered his front lawn around the same time. Daniel introduced himself properly and then gently asked if the HOA usually sent so many notices. The man gave him a knowing look, the kind that said more than words could. He glanced around as if making sure no one was listening, and then said softly, "They're strict with new homeowners. Some say too strict. Best keep your head down." Daniel asked if he also got notices often. The neighbor nodded slowly but didn't want to talk about it. He seemed nervous, like discussing the HOA openly was risky. That made Daniel feel even more uneasy. He tried speaking to another neighbor. The next day, an older woman sitting on her porch knitting. She was friendlier and more open. She told him she used to get notices years ago, but stopped fighting them because arguing only made things worse. She said the board sent letters for everything grass length, mailbox cleanliness, even the color of curtains facing the street. "It's better to just deal with it," she said. "Otherwise, they keep coming after you." The phrase, "coming after you," sat heavily in Daniel's mind. He didn't like the sound of it. He wondered why so many people just accepted this. Why wasn't anyone speaking up? Why did everyone seem scared to question a group that supposedly existed to help the community? Daniel went home that evening feeling troubled. He sat at his small dining table with the 3 notices laid out in front of him. He stared at them for a long time. None of them felt fair. None of them felt necessary. None of them felt like something a responsible community group should send over such tiny things. The next morning, he decided to attend the HOA meeting that was scheduled for later that week. He thought maybe speaking face-to-face would clear things up. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe someone on the board didn't like newcomers. Maybe they were enforcing rules randomly. Before the meeting, he made sure everything around his house looked perfect. He checked the porch, moved his potted plants again, swept the walkway, and made sure the trash bin was completely hidden. He wanted to arrive at the meeting feeling confident that he had nothing out of place. When the day finally came, he walked to the small community center where the meeting was held. He expected a simple gathering, maybe a few people. But when he entered, he noticed the atmosphere felt strangely stiff. About 10 residents sat in metal chairs arranged in rows. At the front sat the board members behind a long table. They all looked serious, almost like they were running a formal court session. Daniel sat quietly in the back. The meeting started with updates about budget plans, minor repairs around the neighborhood, and some landscaping changes. Then came a segment called Community Concerns, where homeowners could speak up if they had questions or issues. Daniel waited until the right moment and raised his hand. The board president, a tall woman with neatly tied hair and a firm tone, called on him. He introduced himself and explained that he had received several notices and just wanted clarification on why they were being issued so quickly after his move. He tried to keep his voice calm and respectful. The president looked at him with a polite but cold expression. She said the notices were simply reminders to help maintain the community standards. When Daniel explained that some of the issues were extremely minor, she cut him off and said all rules must be enforced equally. She didn't sound like someone who cared about context or reason. Daniel tried again, saying he wanted to understand the process better and whether it was normal for new residents to receive several notices so fast. The room grew quiet. A few residents looked away as if they didn't want to be seen listening. The board members exchanged glances. The president finally answered, saying the responsibility is on the homeowner to familiarize himself with the rules. If you follow them, you won't receive notices. Her tone carried a hint of blame, as if Daniel had done something wrong simply by asking questions. He felt a small wave of frustration. He wasn't trying to argue, he just wanted clarity. But the board seemed uninterested in listening. They acted like his concerns were inconvenient. After that, the meeting continued without addressing his points further. Daniel left feeling more unsettled than before. Something about the structure of the meeting, the way the board spoke, and the way the residents stayed silent made him feel the community wasn't as peaceful as it appeared from the outside. Still, Daniel tried to stay hopeful. Maybe the notices would stop. Maybe the board just wanted to remind him to pay attention to details. Maybe everything would settle down if he followed the rules closely. For the next few days, he kept his house in perfect condition. He checked his lawn constantly, wiped down the mailbox, swept the porch even when it didn't need sweeping, and made sure nothing at all looked out of place. But despite all that, another envelope appeared at his door. This one mentioned possible exterior clutter, though Daniel couldn't think of a single thing that counted as clutter. He stood outside for several minutes, looking around his house, trying to understand what they meant. Everything looked clean. Everything was in order. He even checked the side of the house, the backyard, and the porch again. Nothing. That's when something shifted inside him. It wasn't anger. It was more like a strong, firm thought rising up from the part of him that had always been patient, always understanding. The thought said clearly, "This isn't fair." Daniel realized that he wasn't imagining the pattern. The notices weren't random. They kept arriving no matter what he fixed. Something felt off. Something felt targeted. And for the first time since moving in, he wondered if this quiet neighborhood, this place he hoped would bring him peace, was hiding a problem far bigger than he had expected, but he didn't know yet that this first round of small notices was only the beginning. What started as tiny warnings would soon escalate into something much larger, something that would push him into a conflict he never asked for, one that would reveal secrets inside the HOA that no one had expected. And Daniel, without realizing it, was about to become the person who would uncover the truth. Daniel woke up the next morning, still thinking about the latest notice. He tried brushing it off, telling himself he wouldn't let it ruin his day, but something about it kept circling in his mind. He had always been patient and calm, but now he felt like he was living under a spotlight, as if someone was constantly watching his home, waiting for the smallest reason to send another letter. He made himself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, the sun rising softly over the roofs of the houses across the street. Normally, he would enjoy a moment like this, but today he couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling in his chest. The porch looked perfectly clean. The yard looked fine. He had done everything he could. Still, the notice had come. He sat down and looked around, watching people leave for work. A few cars drove by. A woman jogged past with earbuds in. Everything looked normal, peaceful, simple. But he knew something wasn't right beneath the surface. It felt as if everyone knew the HOA was a problem but pretended everything was fine. That kind of silence made him uneasy. After finishing his coffee, Daniel decided to walk around the neighborhood again. He wanted to see if the HOA was truly being fair or if something else was going on. As he walked, he kept an eye on small details, the angles of other trash bins, condition of fences, the decorations people kept on their porches. What he saw surprised him. One house had 2 large flower pots on the front steps, much more noticeable than his small plant. Another house had a small wooden statue near the walkway. A third had a lawn chair leaning against the wall. Further down the street, he noticed a mailbox with chipped paint far worse than his fence. But none of those houses showed signs of receiving notices. No envelopes tucked into the doors. No letters taped onto mailboxes. He tried not to jump to conclusions. But it was obvious. Plenty of homes had small things that could be called violations, yet none of them appeared to be under the same microscope he was under. It felt personal, though he didn't understand why. As he walked back home, he passed by the older woman he had spoken to earlier. She was watering a few plants in her front yard. When she saw him, she offered a small smile, but the smile faded when she saw the expression on his face. "Another notice?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded. "They said something about clutter, but I can't find anything." The woman sighed, lowering her watering can. "It's been like this for years. They think strict rules keep the neighborhood perfect. But sometimes it feels like they're looking for control, not order." "Is it always the same people who get targeted?" Daniel asked. She hesitated before answering. "Mostly newer homeowners. Some people think the board likes testing them. Others believe they just want to show who's in charge. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Why doesn't anyone speak up? She gave him a sad smile. Some did a long time ago. It didn't go well. They either got more letters or were fined for things that didn't make sense. Eventually, people gave up. Daniel didn't like that answer. It didn't feel right that an entire neighborhood lived quietly under pressure because a group of board members made them afraid. Something about it bothered him deeply. Thank you, he said to her before heading back home. All day he tried focusing on work, but his mind kept drifting. He kept thinking about the unfairness of it all, about how the board never explained anything clearly, and how the president had spoken to him during the meeting as if he was a student being scolded by a strict teacher. By afternoon, he made a decision. He wasn't going to sit quietly like everyone else. He wouldn't let fear control him. He wanted answers, and he wanted them directly. He sat at his computer and wrote an email to the HOA board. He kept it calm and respectful. He asked for clarification about the notices, asked if they could point out the specific issues they mentioned, and asked how he could avoid future misunderstandings. He wrote that he wanted to be a good member of the community but needed clear guidance. He read the email twice before sending it. He didn't want it to sound aggressive. He just wanted transparency. The reply came the next morning. It was short and oddly formal. It said his concerns had been noted and that he should review the community guidelines thoroughly. It did not address any of his questions. It did not explain the clutter issue. It did not clarify anything. Daniel stared at the screen, feeling frustration grow inside him. He had tried being polite. He had followed the rules. He had cleaned and organized everything. Yet they treated him like he was causing trouble. Later that day, another envelope appeared on his door. His heart dropped when he saw it. He opened it quickly and read that he had been issued a fine for multiple outstanding violations. His mind went blank for a moment. A fine? For what? He didn't even know what the violations were. He sat on his porch steps, holding the paper, staring at it like it couldn't possibly be real. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was money. Money he was expected to pay for reasons he didn't even understand. His first reaction was disbelief. His second was anger. Not explosive anger, but a deep, heavy kind that came from being treated unfairly for too long. He walked inside, put the letter on the table, and took a deep breath. He needed to think. He decided to call the HOA office directly. Maybe speaking to someone on the phone would clear things up. He found the number on the letter and dialed. The call rang a few times before someone picked up. A woman answered, but she sounded like she was reading from a script. Every question he asked was answered with the same calm but empty tone. He asked what the violations were. She repeated, "Please refer to the guidelines provided during your move-in." He asked who inspected his house. She repeated, "Routine inspections are performed at random."
Out.
He asked if he could appeal the fine. She replied, "You may attend the next board meeting to discuss concerns." He asked if he could speak to someone who actually reviewed his property. She simply said, "Decisions are final unless addressed formally at a meeting." Daniel felt like he was talking to a wall. Nothing made sense. Nothing was explained. It felt deliberate, like they didn't want him to understand what was happening. He hung up the phone feeling more confused than before. That evening, he walked outside and noticed something strange. A man he didn't know was standing across the street, holding a clipboard and writing something down. The man kept glancing at Daniel's house. When Daniel stepped closer to get a better look, the man quickly turned and walked away. Something inside Daniel snapped. Not in an angry way, but in a decisive way. He realized this wasn't normal. This wasn't how a neighborhood should operate. And if this was happening to him, it could happen to anyone. He decided it was time to stop reacting, start acting. The first thing he did was talk to more neighbors. Not everyone wanted to speak openly, but a few did. One neighbor admitted she had been fined for having her curtains too brightly colored. Another said he got a warning because his car tires touched the grass when he parked. Someone else mentioned being fined for leaving a recycling bin out for an extra hour. It was obvious the HOA was out of control. But what surprised Daniel most was how many neighbors felt powerless to stop it. They accepted the unfair rules because they didn't want trouble. The silence around the board wasn't respect, it was fear. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about that fine letter. Thinking about the man with the clipboard, thinking about the way the board president spoke to him. It all felt wrong. By morning, he had made up his mind. This wasn't something he could ignore anymore. If he let this go, the notices would keep coming. The fines would grow. The pressure would continue. And not just for him, but for everyone who lived there. He decided to challenge the fine officially. He reread the letter and saw the line that said he could request a hearing with the board. He wrote a formal request, printed it, and delivered it to the HOA office. 2 days later, he received a notice saying his hearing was scheduled for the upcoming board meeting. The letter also said that failure to attend would result in further penalties. The tone of it made Daniel shake his head. It was written like a threat disguised as a reminder. On the night of the meeting, Daniel arrived early. He took a seat in the front row. He felt nervous, but determined. A few neighbors he had spoken to showed up too, sitting quietly in the back. They didn't say much, but their presence meant something. Maybe they hoped someone else would finally speak up. The board entered the room and sat at their long table. The president greeted everyone with her usual stiff tone. After running through the agenda, she arrived at Daniel's hearing. She called him forward, and he stood facing the board. He presented everything calmly. He explained he had followed the rules, kept his property clean, and still received multiple unexplained notices. He asked again for specific details. He asked to know who had inspected his home. He asked what clutter they were referring to. His voice remained steady, but each word carried the frustration he had kept inside. The board listened with expressionless faces. When he finished, the president folded her hands and delivered an answer that stunned everyone in the room. She told him the fine would remain, that the notices were valid, and that questioning the board's authority could lead to further action. Daniel stared at her, shocked. She hadn't even addressed a single point he made. She dismissed everything as if it didn't matter. Something in him shifted again. He looked at the board members, then at the residents sitting quietly behind him. He could see the fear on their faces. The silence in the room spoke louder than any words. Daniel realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't someone being strict. It was abuse of authority, and he wasn't going to let it continue. What the board didn't know, what they didn't expect, was that Daniel was no longer asking questions. He was preparing for something bigger, something they weren't ready for. Because that night, as he walked home under the streetlights, he made a decision that would change everything. He was going to fight back, not with anger, not with shouting, and not with fear. He was going to fight legally, and the HOA, without realizing it, had just pushed the wrong person too far. Daniel woke up the day after the meeting feeling strangely calm. It wasn't the calm that came from peace, but the kind that comes when a decision has been made and there's no turning back. The fine sitting on his table no longer made him feel confused. The cold response from the board no longer shocked him. He had seen enough to know the problem wasn't small. It wasn't a single mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a system built on fear. He wasn't willing to live under it. He made himself coffee and sat on his porch again. Watching the neighborhood quietly move through its morning routine, cars pulled out of driveways, sprinklers clicked and spun, a dog barked somewhere down the street. Everything looked normal, but he now understood that behind the normal was a quiet frustration shared by many people. A frustration no one dared to show. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about everything that had happened since he moved in the notices. The cold meeting, the man with the clipboard, the lack of answers. If the board thought they could push him around easily, they were mistaken. He spent the morning researching. He read state laws about homeowners associations, rights of residents, and how fines were supposed to work. He searched for stories about people who had dealt with similar issues. There were more than he expected. Some HOAs ran smoothly, but many had reputations for being controlling or unfair. Reading those stories made him feel less alone. It also made him realize something important. HOAs were not above the law. They had rules they had to follow too. Around noon, he came across something that made him pause. According to state law, an HOA must provide proof of violations before issuing fines. They must give clear explanations, evidence, and a chance for the homeowner to correct the issue. Daniel had none of that. The board had simply thrown notices at him without explanation, and when he asked questions, they responded with vague statements and warnings. Suddenly, the fine letter felt different. It wasn't just annoying. It wasn't just unfair. It might actually be illegal, for the first time since the trouble began. Daniel felt something close to confidence. He decided to gather evidence of his own. He took photos of every part of his property: porch, yard, trash bin, fence, mailbox, everything. He saved the letters the HOA had sent and wrote down dates and descriptions of each one. He kept notes about the meeting and the phone call with the office. He even wrote down the moment he saw the man with the clipboard staring at his house. It felt strange to document everything in such detail. But he knew it could matter later. He had heard stories of people losing cases because they didn't keep records. Daniel wasn't going to make that mistake. In the late afternoon, he walked around to a few neighbors he had spoken with before. He told them carefully that he was planning to challenge the HOA. He didn't try to convince them to do the same. He didn't pressure them. He simply said he wasn't going to stay silent. Most of them looked surprised. Some looked worried. But one neighbor, an older man who had lived there for years, nodded slowly and said, "It's about time someone stood up to them." Another neighbor, the woman who knitted on her porch, said she wished she had fought back years ago but didn't know how. She wanted to know if she could share her old letters with him. Daniel told her she didn't have to do anything she wasn't comfortable with. But she quietly went inside and returned with a small folder filled with notices she had saved over the years. The letters were similar to his vague complaints, warnings, sometimes fines, all without clear explanations. Daniel thanked her, and she smiled for the first time in a long while, as if she finally felt seen. That night, he researched attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. He found one with good reviews who had handled cases like his before. The next morning, he made an appointment. Walking into the attorney's office felt a little intimidating, but the man behind the desk greeted him with a friendly nod. Daniel explained everything from the beginning: the notices, the fine, the meeting, the lack of evidence. He showed the photos and letters and told the attorney about the neighbors' experiences, though the attorney listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, he leaned back and said something Daniel didn't expect. "You have a strong case." Daniel blinked. "Really?" The attorney nodded. "HOAs can enforce rules, but they can't make them up as they go. They must follow state law. From what you've shown me, it looks like they've been issuing notices without proper grounds. The fine, especially, is questionable." Hearing that made Daniel feel a mix of relief and anger. Relief because he wasn't exaggerating. Anger because the board had made him feel like he was the problem. When they were the ones abusing power, the attorney continued, "If you want, we can send them a formal request for documentation. They'll have to produce evidence or admit they don't have any." Daniel agreed. He felt a sense of strength growing inside him, something he hadn't felt since he moved into the neighborhood. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was taking control. The attorney wrote a letter on his behalf that same day. It asked the HOA to provide photos of the violations, inspection logs, names of the inspectors, and specific details about the supposed clutter. It also asked for clarification on why other homes with similar conditions were not cited. The letter was firm but professional. It set a deadline for the HOA to respond. Daniel left the office feeling hopeful. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he finally felt like he wasn't alone. 3 days later, an envelope appeared at his door again. He opened it with a strange mix of anticipation and frustration. Inside was not an explanation. It wasn't evidence. It was a short statement saying the board needed more time to review his request. Daniel took the letter to the attorney, who laughed softly and said, "They're stalling." "What does that mean?" Daniel asked. "It means they don't have the evidence ready. Sometimes that's because it doesn't exist." Daniel felt a slow, steady determination building. If the HOA expected him to back down, they were mistaken. As the days passed, Daniel noticed something around the neighborhood. People who usually kept to themselves started watching him with quiet curiosity. Some offered him short nods as he walked by. One neighbor stopped him during an afternoon walk and whispered, "Good luck. We're all hoping you win." It was the first time Daniel truly understood how much pressure the HOA had created in the community. People didn't just dislike the rules, they felt trapped by them. A week later, the HOA finally responded with another envelope. Daniel opened it carefully, hoping for answers. Instead, the letter said the board had reviewed his concerns and determined that all violations were valid according to the community guidelines. No evidence was attached. No photos. No inspector notes. Nothing. Daniel stared at the page for a long moment. Then he shook his head and smiled. Not a happy smile, but a confident one. He knew exactly what this meant. They weren't taking him seriously. He took the letter to his attorney again. After reading it, the attorney placed it on the desk and said, "We move forward. What's the next step?" Daniel asked. "We file a complaint." Daniel felt a chill run through him. "A lawsuit?" The attorney nodded. "Yes, and if what we suspect is true, the court will force them to provide documentation. If they've been abusing their authority, it will come out." Daniel sat quietly for a moment, letting the idea sink in. Filing a lawsuit wasn't something he ever imagined himself doing, but he had been pushed into this corner. He wasn't fighting just for himself anymore. He was fighting for the neighbors who had been intimidated for years. "All right," Daniel said finally. "Let's do it." The attorney nodded and began preparing the documents. As Daniel watched him work, he felt something shift inside him again, not fear, not anger, but purpose. He wasn't just defending his home. He was defending the right to live in peace. The lawsuit was filed at the end of the week. Daniel expected the board to send someone to talk to him, maybe try to negotiate, maybe show some willingness to explain. But instead, the neighborhood went quiet around him, quieter than before. It felt like everyone knew something big had started. Some neighbors whispered among themselves. Others avoided eye contact, as if they didn't want to be seen taking sides. But Daniel wasn't alone. A few neighbors he had spoken to continued to check on him. The older woman brought him cookies one evening, saying she hoped things would turn out right. Another neighbor offered to mow his lawn so that the HOA wouldn't try to use it against him. The support meant more to him than he admitted. 2 weeks passed before the HOA responded to the lawsuit. When Daniel and his attorney opened the response, they were shocked. The HOA claimed Daniel had been aggressive, had refused to follow community rules, and had created disturbances. They even claimed neighbors had complained about him. None of it was true. As Daniel read the lies, he felt something heavy settle in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was disappointment. Deep disappointment that the board would resort to false claims just to protect their authority. The attorney looked at him and said calmly, "This actually works in your favor." "How?" Daniel asked, confused. "Because now they have to prove it. And lies are very difficult to prove." Hearing that gave Daniel strength again. The next few weeks were busy. The attorney requested documents through legal channels. The HOA dragged their feet, provided incomplete files, or said records were missing. Every delay made the attorney more certain something was wrong behind the scenes. Daniel's life became a strange mix of normal routines and ongoing legal stress. He went to work, took care of his house, cooked meals, and tried to stay calm. But each time he passed a board member or saw another clipboard in the neighborhood, he felt a reminder of the conflict waiting beneath the surface. One evening, just as he was closing his curtains for the night, he noticed a car slowly driving past his house. It moved unusually slow, then sped up when he stepped outside. That moment made him realize something important. The board wasn't just stubborn. They were nervous. They knew something was slipping out of their control, and Daniel had no idea that the truth they were trying to hide was something no one in the neighborhood expected, not even him. The lawsuit had only just begun, but it was already stirring the shadows of the HOA, and soon Daniel would discover something that would change the entire direction of the fight. Something bigger than unfair notices, something bigger than fines, something that would shock not just him, but the whole neighborhood. and it was coming faster than anyone realized. When the court date finally arrived, the atmosphere around the neighborhood felt different. People who once kept their eyes down now watched everything more closely. They noticed who walked into the courthouse, who avoided looking at others, and who whispered quietly in their driveways. For so long, the community had felt controlled by the board, especially by the president who acted as if the rules belonged to her alone. Now, everything seemed to be shifting. It all centered around what would come out in this hearing. The morning started quietly, with a soft sky and cool air. The homeowner who had filed the lawsuit, a calm and thoughtful man named Daniel, drove to the courthouse with a steady but nervous heart. He didn't enjoy conflict, and he never wanted to be the person making a scene. But after months of unfair warnings, rude letters, and threats masked as friendly reminders, he knew he had no choice. It wasn't only about him anymore. Neighbors had opened up to him. Some shared stories about being fined for things they didn't even do. Some showed him letters they were too afraid to challenge. One neighbor told him she would get stomach pain every time she saw an envelope from the board, because it always meant something stressful. All of that stayed in his mind as he walked into the courthouse. His lawyer, a patient man with a calm presence, greeted him and went over the plan again. They weren't trying to destroy anyone's reputation. They only wanted fairness and transparency. The case had started small, just about the fines and harassment. But during the discovery process, something unusual appeared. There were gaps in the financial reports. Expenses listed without receipts. Payments made without explanation. Transactions that seemed to come from nowhere. The board had tried to brush it all off. They said the records were old, or the receipts had been misplaced, or the accountant was working on it. But Daniel's lawyer didn't let it go. He requested full documentation, and the judge agreed. Right then, the board realized this was no longer a simple disagreement. Something was coming to light. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt heavier. The HOA board members sat together at one table. The president sat in the center, her back straight, her expression sharp. Her usual confidence looked thinner now, almost tight, like she was trying too hard to seem unbothered. A few neighbors attended quietly, sitting in the benches along the back. They didn't say anything, but their presence mattered. They were there not only out of curiosity, but because they wanted to see change. They were tired of feeling controlled and powerless. When the hearing began, the judge asked for the financial documents that had been requested. The board's lawyer handed over a stack of papers, but even from a distance, it was clear something was off. The pages looked incomplete. Only a few receipts, a handful of transaction logs, several pages with numbers but no explanations. Daniel's lawyer took the stack, scanned them, and calmly pointed out that several months of expenses were missing. Entire sections of the financial reports were absent. Purchases labeled community improvement had no details. And most concerning of all, several large transactions were listed with nothing but a single word: reimbursement. The room became still when he said that word. Everyone knew reimbursements were only supposed to happen. Someone spent their own money for something that benefited the entire community. But reimbursements without receipts? That was a major red flag. The board's lawyer tried to brush it aside again. He said the documents were as complete as could be expected. But the judge wasn't satisfied. She leaned forward and asked the board directly if the missing receipts existed. The president hesitated for a moment, then claimed they did but were misplaced. The judge didn't accept that. She ordered the board to produce a full and accurate record within a strict time frame. Her voice was firm, clear, and unquestionable. She reminded them that an HOA handles community funds. Any leader who manages money must be transparent and accountable. As soon as she said that, the president's face changed. It faded from confidence to worry, then slipped into frustration. She glanced at the board members beside her, and a few shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly unsure whether they should even be sitting next to her. After the hearing ended, neighbors gathered outside the courthouse, talking quietly. No one wanted to speak too loudly, but the shock on their faces said everything. Many of them suspected something had been wrong for a long time, but they never dreamed it would involve money. Some wondered aloud how much had been taken. Some asked how long this had been happening. Others simply said they felt relieved that it was finally being exposed. Daniel didn't join the small crowd of neighbors. He stepped aside with his lawyer and took a few breaths. He felt mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt proud that the truth was finally coming out. On the other hand, he felt sad that the community had been misled for so long. He thought about all the people who trusted the board, who paid their dues on time, who believed the rules were being enforced fairly. Now they had to accept that someone they trusted had not been honest. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood grew thicker. People whispered as they walked their dogs. Some looked at the president's house with confusion or anger. Others avoided eye contact, unsure of what to say. The board tried to act like nothing was wrong. They sent out a newsletter saying everything was under control and that the community should remain confident in their leadership. But no one believed it anymore. When the board submitted the second set of financial documents to the judge, the truth finally showed itself. This time they couldn't hide anything. The judge had ordered them to provide every record, every receipt, every transaction. The missing pieces told a clear story. Over the past couple of years, the president had been using HOA funds for expenses that had nothing to do with the neighborhood. There were receipts for home repairs done on her personal property, receipts for furniture bought for her living room, charges for weekend trips, payments labeled as consulting fees that went directly into an account under her name. And the reimbursements, those were the largest. They were supposedly for community maintenance, but there was no record of any actual work being done. When these documents became public as part of the court record, the news spread through the neighborhood faster than anyone expected. Some neighbors felt angry, others felt betrayed, and some felt embarrassed for trusting the board for so long. A few were quiet for many days, processing the shock. The next HOA meeting was different from any meeting before. People who normally skipped meetings showed up. The room filled completely. Some stood near the walls, arms crossed. Others held papers or copies of the financial records. The president walked in with a stiff expression, pretending to remain calm, but the room's energy had changed. People no longer feared her. They felt something new: confidence. One older resident asked her directly why HOA money had been spent on her property. She tried to give a short, vague explanation, claiming it was temporary use for community research, but no one believed it. Someone else held up a printed receipt and asked if she really expected the neighborhood to believe the HOA needed luxury furniture. Soon, more people spoke up. They described times when they were fined unfairly, times when they were told that if they argued, the fines would get worse, times when meetings were shut down before anyone could ask questions. A man in the back shared that he once tried to volunteer for the board, but was quietly discouraged. As if the existing members didn't want new people getting too close, the president's face lost all signs of control. She grew defensive, raising her voice, insisting she had done nothing wrong. But the board members on her side slowly leaned away from her, distancing themselves. One even cleared his throat and admitted he had never seen the financial reports either. Another confessed she didn't know reimbursements required receipts. Something the entire community knew wasn't true. It was clear the board was falling apart, piece by piece. When the truth was undeniable, a quiet tension settled in the room. One neighbor suggested a vote to remove the president immediately. Another agreed. A third said they needed a new board altogether. It's not just a new president. The vote wasn't planned, but it happened naturally. Hands went up across the room, one after another, like the entire neighborhood had finally found its courage at the same time. No one hesitated. Only a couple of hands stayed down. The president glared at them, as if expecting support, but even they avoided meeting her eyes. The vote was overwhelming. She was removed instantly. After the meeting, people stepped outside into the cool night air. Their voices were softer now, less tense. Some were relieved. Others were still processing everything they had learned. But the weight in the air had lifted. The community felt different, freer, almost lighter. Over the next few days, neighbors who never spoke before began talking. People waved to each other. Some apologized to Daniel for not speaking earlier. One neighbor admitted she had wanted to stand up to the board years ago, but felt scared. Another said he had always sensed something was wrong, but didn't know what to do. Daniel listened to all of them with patience. He didn't blame anyone. He understood how hard it was to challenge people who acted like they had all the power. He knew how intimidating it was to question something that had been in place for so long. The court case continued. Of course, the judge reviewed the full documents and made it clear that HOA had broken rules, misused funds, and mistreated homeowners. There were consequences, real ones. The former president would have to repay a large amount of money. The new board would need financial training. And the HOA would be monitored for a while to make sure everything stayed transparent by the time part 4 of this story came to an end. The community was no longer the quiet, fearful place it had been months earlier. It was changing, rebuilding itself, becoming healthier. And the truth once hidden had finally come into the open where it belonged. It was the beginning of something new. When the final decision from the court came, it felt almost unreal for the people in the neighborhood. It was one thing to hear rumors, see documents, and listen to meetings where the truth slowly unfolded. But to see the judge's ruling, written clearly, with every detail explained and every violation listed, felt like the closing of a long chapter. For months, the community had been living with fear, stress, and arguments. Now, there was finally an answer. The judge ordered the former HOA president to repay a large portion of the money she had taken through fake reimbursements and personal spending. The amount shocked many people. But it also confirmed what they had suspected, that the situation had been going on for far longer than anyone thought. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something intentional, something she thought she could get away with because no one would challenge her. The court also required the new board to follow strict guidelines for transparency. Every receipt had to be uploaded and shared. Every meeting had to be recorded and made available to the homeowners. Every fine had to be supported by a clear rule and explanation. The judge even said that if the board failed to follow these steps, she would take further action. For the first time in a long time, the homeowners felt hopeful. The new board was elected very carefully. People didn't want the same problem to happen again, so they chose members who were calm, honest, and genuinely cared about the community. One of them was a quiet older woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. Another was a young father who always helped fix things around the neighborhood without asking for anything in return. There was also a man who had financial experience and volunteered to organize the accounting system properly. Many people tried to convince Daniel to join the board too, since he was the one who brought everything to light, but he politely said no. He explained that he never wanted to be in a leadership position. He only wanted fairness, and he believed the new board members were more than capable. Still, the neighbors insisted that his voice mattered, so he agreed to attend meetings and give advice when needed. Life in the neighborhood slowly changed. The first big sign of improvement came when the new board announced a community gathering at the park down the street. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple evening with snacks, music, and time for people to talk. But the meaning behind it was powerful. For so long, meetings were tense and cold. People felt judged, watched, or pressured. Now the board wanted connection instead of control. On the day of the gathering, the weather was warm and peaceful. Children played near the swings, running around like they didn't have a care in the world. Neighbors who barely spoke before now stood together chatting. Some apologized to each other for misunderstandings. Others laughed about old memories that they hadn't shared in years. The atmosphere felt lighter than anyone had seen in a long time. One woman approached Daniel with a gentle smile. She told him she was sorry for not supporting him earlier, explaining that she felt too scared to speak up, worried she would get fined. Another man put a hand on Daniel's shoulder and said the entire community owed him a thank you. Someone else added that if he hadn't taken that first step, none of this would have come out. Daniel felt a little embarrassed by all the attention, but he appreciated it. He told them he simply did what he thought was right. He didn't want anyone to be afraid of living in their own home. He never imagined things would go as far as they did, but he was glad that everything eventually surfaced. As the evening went on, the new board made a short announcement. They talked about the changes they were planning. They wanted to use the HOA funds for things that actually mattered: fixing cracks on the sidewalks, repainting the community sign, planting flowers near the entrance, and maybe even creating a small area for outdoor seating. They also talked about lowering some unnecessary fees that the former board had raised without explanation. People clapped softly and nodded with relief. It felt like the community was finally moving forward.